Good afternoon, fourth grade. Today we're going to continue reading in our text, taxation without representation. We're going to talk about that in parallel teaching, and then today we have another article that zooms in kind of on one event, the Boston Tea Party. But before we get started, we have a quick write for you. It says, describe a time when someone made a decision without asking you. How did you feel and what happened? Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for the focus question. Focus question says, how did taxation without representation affect the American colonists? And we have three vocabulary words. The first one is tax. That's when you have to pay the government money. Draw a line to this picture. The second one is represent. That's when you choose someone to speak for you or make decisions for you. And so we are in a campaign right now where the American people are trying to choose who they want to represent the country as president. Draw a line to the candidates. And the last one is import. That's when another country brings their goods to your country to sell them. Draw a line to this picture. And then turn the page. You should be on the page that says read aloud a very messy tea party, and you should have the tea party text out on your desk. And we know that this is a nonfiction text because the tea party actually did happen. And so I'm going to use my strategy by asking a how or why question about the title. And that's going to help me make sure I understand what I'm reading as I go along. So I said, why was there a very messy tea party? And as I'm reading, I'm going to keep that in mind to make sure that I can find out the main idea. Let's begin reading at the first paragraph. If you know anything about the English people, you probably know that many of them love tea. Ever since tea was first imported from Great Britain from China, the English have enjoyed a nice hot cup of tea in the afternoon. And in the 1700s, they brought this habit with them in their colonies in North America. In the early 1700s, the British government made a special deal with the East India Company, an English organization doing trade in the East Indies. They granted the East India Company a monopoly on tea by agreeing that no other company was allowed to sell tea in Britain or its colonies. This was a great deal for the East India Company, since it meant that the company could charge whatever it wanted for its products. It already costs a lot to get a crate of tea from India to England, and government taxes made the cost of tea even higher. And we'll stop right there. So what the British government did is that they said, we will only sell this tea from the East India Company. That's like the U.S. government saying, like, we will only drink Sprite. We won't have Sierra Mist, we won't have Dr. Pepper, we won't have Mountain Dew. Sprite will be the only soft drink. And then not only will it be the only soft drink, but Sprite is going to cost you, instead of $1.50, Sprite is now going to cost you $4. And so you can imagine why that would make a lot of people upset, especially if Sprite isn't their favorite soft drink, and now they have to pay more for it. Okay, so let's go to 1A. It says, how did the money on the tea with the East India Company affect the price of tea in the colonies? And we know that because the East India Company was the only company that would sell tea, they actually raised their prices. And then the government taxed that, so it costs even more. So in box 1A, we would write down, because the company did not have any competition for prices, they could charge as much as they wanted. Therefore, the price of tea increased for the colonists. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready to keep reading. We're in the third paragraph. In the British colonies of North America, colonists did not like having to pay such high prices. Rather than overpay for tea from England, they turned to Dutch smugglers who sneaked the tea that was just as good and less expensive. This was a violation of the English monopoly and against the law, but the colonists didn't care. They got the same cup of tea and had enough money left over to buy cookies for dipping. So if we stop right there, 1B asks us, how did the colonists respond to the high price of tea? And we know that they actually, they were upset. So they allowed tea to be smuggled in from other countries, even though they weren't supposed to. But they got it cheaper, and it was a tea that they liked better. So that's like saying, if we can only drink Sprite, someone that can get Dr. Pepper. And they are going to charge you $2 for that Dr. Pepper instead of $4 for Sprite. And so even though you're not supposed to be buying Dr. Pepper, you do it anyways because that's what you want. Okay? So in box 1B, we would write, the colonists bought tea from Dutch smugglers, which was illegal but also less expensive. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready to keep reading. We're in the fourth paragraph. The East India Company, however, didn't like this one bit. By the 1760s, they were losing hundreds of thousands of pounds per year. Pounds is the British dollars, so they were losing a lot of money to the Dutch smugglers. A fortune in the time when 60 pounds a year was considered a good income. Rather than change their prices to compete with the Dutch smugglers, the company asked the British government for help. Parliament agreed and passed a series of acts in 1767 that would change the course of history. So let's go to 2A. It says, how did the colonists' smuggling affect the East India Company? And if we go back in our text, it tells us that the East India Company actually ended up losing a lot of money because no one was buying their tea. So in 2A, we would write, the East India Company lost hundreds of thousands of pounds per year, which was considered a lot of money. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for 2B. It says, how did the East India Company, that should say East, how did the East India Company try to get their money back? And if we go back in the text, it tells us that the company asked the British government for help, and Parliament agreed, and it passed some laws for the colonists. So on 2B, we would write, instead of lowering its prices, the East India Company asked British Parliament to help keep the colonists from smuggling tea into North America. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready to keep reading. Turn the page, and you see we have some subheadings. So I've asked a how or why question about the subheadings, and I've underlined the answers. It says a tax on tea, and my question was, why was there a tax on tea? With a stroke of a pen, the Townshend Acts raised the prices the colonists paid on all sorts of things. Glass, lead, glass, paint, and paper all became more expensive, but today the acts are best remembered for raising the price colonists had to pay for tea. So we will stop right there. We know that there was a tax on tea because Parliament passed the Townshend Acts. So in 3A, we would write, Parliament taxed tea in the Townshend Acts to punish the colonists for smuggling tea and taking money away from the East India Company. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready to keep reading. We're in the second paragraph. The colonists were outraged, and not just because they had to spend more money at the market. It was the second time the British government had taxed them to pay for the government's expenses. After the incredibly unpopular Stamp Act in 1765, the colonists did not think it was fair. According to the British tradition, a tax could not be enacted or levied after elected officials agreed on it. For people living in England, this meant that taxes had to be voted on by Parliament. But the colonists didn't have any representatives in Parliament. They didn't have any representatives at all. And so the reason that the colonists are angry is because they're supposed to have someone in British Parliament telling all of the other people how expensive it would be if they kept taxing the colonists. They don't have anyone to convince British Parliament that it's not a good idea. And so British Parliament keeps voting to tax the colonists instead of voting to tax the people that are in Great Britain. And so because the colonists are far away and they don't have any representation, they just said, oh, we'll tax them instead of taxing the people that live down the street. So in 3B, it asks us, why were the colonists angered by the tax? And if we go back in our text, we are able to find the answer. They didn't have any representatives, and that's actually against the law. So in 3B, we would write, the colonists were angered by the tax because in England, taxes could not be enacted without elected officials agreeing on them. And the colonists had not elected any representatives to vote on the taxes they were forced to pay. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready to keep reading. We are at that last paragraph. It says, the common phrase, no taxation without representation, became popular then, referring to the government taxing people without their consent. And now we're in the next section called Sons of Liberty. And I have a how question. How did the Sons of Liberty respond to the tax on tea? And I'm going to summarize this paragraph because we're running out of time. But basically, Parliament was forcing the colonists to accept these ships that had the British tea on it instead of the Dutch tea. And that made the colonists very unhappy. And so in November 1773, second paragraph, the Dartmouth, a tea ship, arrived in Boston Harbor carrying thousands of pounds of discounted yet taxed tea. But the people of Boston didn't want to buy this tea. They didn't want to drink it. They didn't even want to let it off the ship. Led by Samuel Adams, protesters calling themselves the Sons of Liberty did everything they could to make the captain of the ship turn around and go home. But the British governor did not let the Dartmouth leave. Finally, on December 16th, a sizable group of colonists sneaked aboard the Dartmouth disguised as Native Americans. Working quietly, they emptied the holds of the Dartmouth and two other ships that had recently docked in port. 342 chests of tea went into the frigid Boston Harbor, a statement that Britain and the East India Company could not ignore. No matter how cheap the product, if it was taxed, the colonists did not want it. And that night is known as the Boston Tea Party. So we make sure you underline the answers to 4A and B and write them down in the box.